I am 94 years old. For 70 of those years, I have carried something that has shaped every conversation I've had, every relationship I've maintained, and every night I've spent lying awake watching the ceiling. My wife knew. She made me promise never to speak of it. I kept that promise through her illness, through her death, through the year of silence that followed. But I will not take this to my grave. In the winter of 1956, I was a young fisherman working the pre-dawn waters off the coast, alone. Something surfaced beside my boat that morning. It was not a seal. It was not a trick of exhaustion or fog. It looked at me with eyes that held intelligence, intent, and something I can only describe as recognition. What happened in the minutes that followed, what it communicated, what it asked of me, became the defining secret of my life. I told my wife when I returned to shore. She listened. Then she told me never to speak those words again to anyone, not to the priest, not to the doctor, not to our children when they came. She said it with the kind of certainty that shapes a marriage, and I understood she was protecting something larger than my need to be believed, so I stayed silent. Through decades of questions from researchers, through conversations with other fishermen who hinted at their own encounters, through moments when staying quiet felt like a kind of madness, I am speaking now because silence no longer protects anyone. The people who could have been hurt by the truth are gone, and I am old enough that whatever consequences come from breaking this vow matter less than letting it die with me. What I saw that morning was real. What happened between us was real. And if there are others carrying similar secrets, still protecting promises made to frightened wives or tight-lipped communities, perhaps hearing this will matter. This is the full account. I will leave nothing out. His name is William Avery. He lives in a narrow house 3 streets back from the harbor in a coastal town that has watched its fishing industry collapse over the past 40 years. The house smells like old wood and instant coffee. The furniture is unchanged from when his wife was alive. Floral patterns, worn armrests, photographs on every surface showing a family built around a man who was never quite fully present. He is thin now, his hands still large but mottled with age spots. The thick fingers that once hauled nets reduced to something more fragile. But when he holds those hands out to demonstrate the size of what surfaced beside his boat, they steady. The tremor that affects his grip on a coffee cup disappears when he returns to that morning, muscle memory perhaps, or the body recognizing the difference between casual gesture and testimony. I need you to understand what kind of man I was then, he says, and his voice carries the flattened vowels of someone who has spent his life in this region. I wasn't religious in any serious way. I went to church because my wife went to church. I didn't believe in ghosts or spirits or any of that. I believed in weather and tides and what I could see with my own eyes, practical things. He was 24 in 1956. The war had ended 11 years prior. He had not served. A childhood injury to his leg kept him stateside, but he had grown up surrounded by men who returned with the particular silence that marked that generation. He learned early that some things were not discussed. You carried them. You functioned. You built a life on top of whatever foundation the past had left you. My father was a fisherman, his father before him. I started going out on boats when I was 12. By 24, I had my own small operation. Nothing grand, just me and a wooden boat, and enough knowledge to make a living if the weather cooperated. I worked alone most of the time, cheaper that way, and I preferred it. The isolation of pre-dawn fishing was total. He would leave the harbor at 4 in the morning, sometimes earlier, navigating by stars and memory to the places where he knew fish gathered. No radio communication in those days beyond basic emergency channels that barely functioned. No other boats visible in the darkness, just the sound of the engine, the smell of salt and diesel, and the cold that worked its way through every layer of clothing. People don't understand how dark it is out there before dawn, not city dark, where there's always some light bleeding from Somewhere, I mean dark, like being inside a closed room, the water is black, the sky is black. You use a lantern to check your nets, and beyond that small circle of light, there's nothing. You're alone in a way that's hard to explain to someone who hasn't experienced it. He fished those waters for 3 years before the encounter. He knew every submerged rock formation, every seasonal current shift, every place where the bottom dropped away into deeper channels. He took pride in that knowledge. It was the inheritance his father had given him, the accumulated wisdom of generations of men who had made their living from the same stretch of coast. I was good at it, he says. And there is no pride in his voice, just statement of fact. I could read weather. I knew when to go out and when to stay in. I knew what the water looked like when fish were feeding below the surface. I never had an accident, never had a serious injury. I was careful and I was competent, and those were the qualities that mattered. When he speaks about the morning in question, his cadence changes. The sentences become shorter. He pauses more frequently, as if double-checking each detail against the memory he has preserved with forensic precision. It was January 18th, I think, though I'd have to check the old log to be certain. Cold enough that ice formed on the railings overnight. I went out at 4:30. There was no wind. The water was calm. Conditions were perfect. He stops. His hands rest on his knees. The house is quiet except for the distant sound of traffic and the irregular ticking of a clock in another room. I've spent 70 years remembering that morning, not trying to remember. That implies effort. I mean, I've carried it with me every single day, every hour. When people talk about photographic memory, I don't know if they mean what I have, but I can close my eyes right now and see exactly what the water looked like, hear exactly what the engine sounded like when I cut it to check the nets. I can feel the cold on my face and smell the salt and describe the precise way the darkness started to thin at the horizon. His wife, Margaret, died 14 months ago. They had been married 68 years. She was the only person he ever told about the encounter, and she was the person who insisted he never tell anyone else. He honored that instruction with the kind of fidelity that defined his generation's understanding of marriage, absolute, unquestioned, structural. She didn't forbid me out of cruelty. She was protecting us, protecting our future. In 1956, if you told people you'd seen something like what I saw, you were either lying or crazy. Either way, you were finished. No one would fish with you. No one would buy from you. The talk would follow our children. Margaret understood that faster than I did. So when I came home that morning and told her, she listened until I was finished. And then she made me promise. And I kept that promise. He kept it through close calls. Through an evening in 1973 when a researcher studying maritime folklore came to town asking questions about unusual sightings. Through a conversation in 1989 with his eldest son, who was considering writing a book about the family's fishing history, and pressed him about whether anything strange had ever happened on the water. Through a hospital stay in 2003 when, heavily medicated after surgery, he nearly spoke about it to a nurse who had asked if he'd ever seen anything he couldn't explain. Every time I stopped myself, even when Margaret was dying and I thought maybe the promise didn't matter anymore, I kept it. Because she'd asked me to, and because part of me still believed that speaking about it would bring some kind of consequence I couldn't predict. But Margaret is gone now. Their children are grown, their reputations established independent of him. The fishing industry he was part of has mostly disappeared, replaced by regulations and economics that made small operations like his obsolete. The community that might have judged him has scattered or died. The stakes that once seemed so enormous have dissolved. I'm speaking now because I'm old enough that I don't care what people think, and because I've realized that taking this to my grave means no one will ever know what's out there. If I'm the only person who saw what I saw, then my silence makes me complicit in a kind of erasure. and I don't want that." He leans forward slightly, his eyes still sharp despite the age that has weakened everything else. "What I'm going to tell you is exactly what happened. I won't embellish. I won't speculate beyond what I can support. I've had 70 years to doubt myself, to try to explain it away, to convince myself I was wrong about what I saw. None of that worked. So I'm left with the truth, and the truth is what I'm going to give you." To understand why William Avery kept silent for 70 years, you must first understand the world that shaped him, the particular intersection of post-war pragmatism, maritime isolation, and the unspoken codes that governed men's lives in small coastal communities during the 1950s. Fishing in 1956 was not the commercialized, technology-dependent industry it would become. It was still a craft passed down through families, reliant on inherited knowledge and physical endurance. Men worked alone or in small crews, leaving harbor in darkness and returning with whatever the sea had given them. There was no GPS, no fish-finding sonar, no satellite weather forecasting. Navigation was done by landmark recognition, compass, and the kind of intuition that came from spending years on the same waters. William's boat was typical for a small, independent operation, a 32-foot wooden hull with a single diesel engine built in 1947 by a local shipwright who had learned his trade before the war. It had a small wheelhouse that offered minimal protection from weather, an open deck for working nets, and storage below for the catch. The equipment was basic: hand-hauled nets, a compass, a depth line, and a lantern for the pre-dawn hours. The radio was unreliable, useful only for emergency broadcasts within a few miles of shore. "You went out in conditions that would terrify people now," William says. 4 in the morning, complete darkness, water temperature in the 40s, alone. If something went wrong, if the engine failed, or you got tangled in your own nets or you slipped and hit your head, no one would know until you didn't come back. And by then it might be too late. This isolation was not considered unusual. It was the economic reality of small-scale fishing. Hiring a crew member meant splitting profits. Working alone meant keeping everything you caught. For a young man trying to establish himself, trying to save money to marry and start a family, the risk of solo operation was simply the price of self-sufficiency. The men who did this work were shaped by necessity into a particular kind of stoicism. William's generation had grown up during the Depression, had watched fathers struggle and fail, had learned that survival meant keeping your head down and your mouth shut. The war had reinforced these lessons. The men who returned, and William knew many who had served in the Pacific, in Europe, in places they would not name, came back with a capacity for silence that marked everything they did afterward. You didn't complain. You didn't make excuses. You certainly didn't tell people about things that would make them question your competence. If you saw something you couldn't explain, you filed it away and moved on. That's how you survived. The cultural climate of the 1950s added another layer of pressure. This was the era of McCarthyism, of conformity as civic duty, of deep suspicion toward anything that deviated from accepted norms. It was also, paradoxically, a period of intense fascination with the unexplained. UFO sightings spiked during this decade. Stories about government cover-ups and secret experiments circulated widely. But there was a crucial distinction. It was acceptable to be curious about these phenomena, even to enjoy speculating about them. But it was social suicide to claim direct experience. If you said you'd seen a UFO, people would think you were trying to get attention or you'd lost your mind. Either way, you were marked. And in a small town where your reputation was everything, where people decided whether to do business with you based on whether they trusted you, you couldn't afford that mark. Maritime communities had their own complicated relationship with the unexplained. Fishermen were, by necessity, observant. They noticed patterns in animal behavior, changes in water conditions, anomalies that might signal danger or opportunity. They were also superstitious in ways that contradicted their practical nature, carrying talismans, observing taboos about words you didn't say at sea, maintaining rituals that had been passed down for generations. But there was a clear boundary between acceptable superstition and dangerous testimony. It was one thing to acknowledge that the sea held mysteries, that men had seen strange things throughout history. It was another thing entirely to claim you had personally interacted with something that shouldn't exist. My father told me once that the ocean kept its secrets, and smart men didn't try to force them into the open. He said that with enough weight that I understood he meant it as a warning. I think now that maybe he'd seen something himself. Maybe a lot of the old fishermen had. But they didn't talk about it, so I never knew for certain. The town William worked out of was small, maybe 1,500 people, built around the harbor and the cannery and the marine supply store. Everyone knew everyone else's business. Gossip traveled faster than news. A man's reputation, for competence, for honesty, for stability, was currency. You built it slowly over years and could lose it in a single careless conversation. William and Margaret married in 1955. He was 23, she was 21. They met at a church social, courted with the formality that was still standard in their community, and married with the understanding that they would build a life based on his fishing income and her work in the cannery office. They were saving for a house. They wanted children. Everything they were working toward depended on William maintaining his reputation as a reliable, competent fisherman. When something threatens all of that, when you know that speaking up could destroy everything you've built and everything you're planning, you make a calculation. And for most people in my position, that calculation led to silence. Not because we were cowards, because we were responsible to people who depended on us. The morning of January 18, 1956, began like hundreds of others. William woke at 3:45 a.m., dressed in layers against the cold, ate a quick breakfast of bread and coffee, and walked the 3 blocks to the harbor. The streets were empty. The sky was black. The temperature was in the low 30s, cold enough that his breath formed clouds, but not cold enough to create ice on the bay. He reached his boat at 4:15, spent 10 minutes checking equipment and fuel, and departed at 4:30. The engine noise was loud in the stillness, echoing off the warehouses and docks, before fading as he moved into open water. He navigated by memory and compass toward a fishing ground about 4 miles offshore, a place where a reef created upwelling that attracted bait fish and the larger species that fed on them. The crossing took 40 minutes. By the time he reached his destination, the darkness had begun to thin at the eastern horizon, not yet light, but no longer the absolute black of deep night. He cut the engine, letting the boat drift as he prepared to set his nets. "That's when everything changed," he says, "in the silence after the engine stopped. That's when I heard it. I'm 94 years old, and I can tell you what I had for breakfast that morning in January 1956 with more clarity than I can tell you what I ate yesterday. Oatmeal. 2 pieces of toast with butter, not margarine. Coffee so hot it burned if you didn't wait. My wife made it the same way every morning I fished, and on January 17th, 1956, she made it exactly that way, and I ate it in the dark at 4:30 in the morning while she packed my lunch in the kitchen behind me. I remember the cold, specific cold, the kind that makes your teeth ache when you breathe through your mouth. 28 degrees when I left the house. I checked the thermometer on the porch because I always checked it. Winter fishing meant knowing exactly how cold it was, what that meant for ice on the lines, how your hands would feel by hour 3. The truck started on the second turn. The dock was empty when I arrived at 5:15. I was always first. That was the point. The best fishing happened before dawn, before other boats churned the water, before the engine noise drove everything deep. I'd been working those waters alone for 6 years by then. I knew them in darkness better than most men knew them in daylight. The boat was a 22-foot wooden gill netter. No radio, no electronic navigation. A compass, a watch and knowledge of the coastline that I'd built through repetition and attention. I kept a flashlight in my jacket, but I rarely used it. Your eyes adjust if you let them. Most men didn't have the patience for that adjustment. They'd light up the boat, kill their night vision, miss things. I left the dock at 5:30. The water was calm, not glassy. There was a low swell from the west, maybe 2 feet, rhythmic and even. The kind of movement that becomes invisible once you've spent enough time on the water. Your body stops registering it. I motored out for 40 minutes. My spot was 3 miles offshore, a stretch of water over a rocky shelf where fish congregated in winter. I'd found it 2 years earlier by accident, and I'd told no one about it. Not even my wife knew exactly where I fished. That was how you kept productive water productive. I killed the engine at 6:10. The silence after an engine stops on open water is total. City people don't understand that kind of silence. It's not an absence of sound. It's the presence of sounds you can't hear over anything else. Water against the hull, your own breathing, the creak of wood settling. The sky was still dark, but dawn was coming. That in-between time when the eastern horizon starts to separate from the sea, when you can't see color yet, but you can see the line between water and air. Nautical twilight, they call it. The time when everything is visible and nothing is clear. I started setting the nets at 6:15. I'd done it thousands of times. The motion was automatic. Feed the net over the side, let the floats carry the top line while the weights pull the bottom down, create a wall of mesh that fish swim into without seeing. I worked methodically, paying attention to the set but not thinking about it. My mind was on other things. Bills, mostly. We'd had medical expenses that winter. My wife's sister had been sick. I was 20 minutes into setting the net when I heard the surface break behind me. Not a splash, a break. There's a difference. A splash means something has disturbed water from above or beside. A jump, a strike, something sudden. A break means something has come through from below. A rising. The sound is different, smoother, deliberate. I turned. 15 feet from the port side of my boat, something was at the surface. The light was still low, but I could see. Not details at first. A shape. A silhouette darker than the water around it. Motionless. The swell moved under it, but it didn't move with the swell. It stayed oriented toward me. I stopped working. I don't remember deciding to stop. I remember my hands were still holding net, and then they weren't. And I had moved to the port rail without choosing to move. The shape remained still. I watched it for what felt like a long time, but was probably 30 seconds. My first thought was seal. We had harbor seals in those waters, but the shape was wrong, too vertical. Seals surface horizontal, their bodies parallel to the water. This was upright. Then it moved closer, and I saw the shoulders, human shoulders, the curve of them, the width, the way they broke from the water at an angle that only makes sense on a human torso. I want to be clear about what I'm saying. I was a fisherman. I'd seen seals, sea lions, dolphins, whales, every marine animal that lived in those waters. I knew what they looked like in low light, in high light, in fog, in chop. I knew how they surfaced, how they moved, how their shapes registered against water and sky. This had human shoulders. It came within 10 feet of the boat, close enough that I could see the water running off its skin, close enough that when it tilted its head to look at me, I could see the structure of its face. The eyes were large, larger than human eyes, set slightly farther apart. They reflected the dim light the way an animal's eyes reflect. That faint shine you see when a flashlight catches a deer or a dog. But the reflection was wrong. Not the yellow-green of most animals, something else. Blue-silver. The face was narrow, delicate, human proportions but refined somehow, like someone had taken a human template and made adjustments for a different environment. The nose was minimal. I could see the openings but barely any bridge. The mouth was closed, but I could see its shape. Wider than a human mouth. I thought of dolphins. how their mouths seem to be smiling even when they're not. But this wasn't that. This was a mouth built for a different kind of breathing, a different kind of sound. The skin was pale, not fish pale, not white, something in between. The color of something that lives where light barely reaches but hasn't lost all pigmentation. Smooth, but textured. I could see that even from 10 feet. The texture caught the light differently than human skin. No clothing, no covering. Bare from the shoulders up and below the waterline, I could see the vague shape of the body continuing down, but I couldn't see detail. The water was too dark. We looked at each other. I don't know for how long. Long enough that my heartbeat slowed from its initial spike. Long enough that I registered my own fear and then moved past it into something else. Not calm, not exactly, but a recognition that this moment was happening, and I was inside it, and I needed to pay attention because I would never see this again. It made a sound. The sound came from the back of its throat. Not high-pitched, not musical, the way folklore describes mermaids singing. This was lower, resonant, like the tone you get when you blow across the mouth of a bottle, but modulated, shaped into something that had rhythm, almost syllables. I didn't understand it, but I understood that it was trying to communicate. I want to explain something about my state of mind in that moment. I was not panicking. I was not questioning my sanity. I'd spent too much time on the water to doubt my own observations. Fishermen don't survive by second-guessing what they see. If you see a squall line forming, you don't debate whether it's real. You move. I was seeing this. It was there. The question wasn't whether it existed. The question was what I was supposed to do about it. It made the sound again, and this time it moved one of its arms. I could see the pale shape of it rising from the water, not fully, just the suggestion of movement beneath the surface. The gesture seemed intentional, not a wave, not a beckoning, something in between, an indication, like it was pointing or showing me something. I looked where the gesture indicated, south, away from shore. When I looked back, it had moved closer. 8 feet from the boat now, I could see more detail. The structure of the collarbone, the shape of the neck, which was longer than a human neck, but not grotesque, proportional to the head, which was slightly larger than a human head. The ears were barely visible, not external like ours, just openings with a ridge of skin around them. The hair was matted against its skull and neck. Dark, not black, but very dark brown. Thick, long enough to see the length of it trailing back into the water. I remember thinking it looked heavy, waterlogged, the way human hair looks when someone surfaces after diving. That thought, someone surfaces, stuck in my mind. This wasn't an animal. I knew that with total certainty. This was someone, not something. The distinction mattered in a way I couldn't articulate then, and still struggled to articulate now. It raised its other arm, and this time it broke the surface completely. The hand, God, the hand. 5 fingers, webbed. The webbing stretched between each digit, thin and translucent in the early light. But the fingers themselves were long and deliberate. I watched them move independently, dexterous. The hand of a creature that used tools, that manipulated its environment. Not a flipper, not a fin, a hand. It reached toward the boat, slowly. I could have stepped back. I didn't. I stayed at the rail and watched it extend that hand until it touched the wood. The fingers pressed against the hull, gently, testing. I heard the sound of wet skin on wood. Then it pulled back and made the throat sound again, longer this time, more complex. Patterns inside the sound, repetitions, like it was saying the same thing in multiple ways, hoping one of them would land. I said, "I don't understand." I don't know why I said it out loud. It seemed important to respond, to indicate that I was listening, even if I couldn't interpret. It tilted its head, an entirely human gesture, and made a different sound, shorter, sharper, frustrated. I couldn't tell, but the quality had changed. Then it dove, not away, down, straight down beside the boat. I saw the shape of it as it descended, the full length of the body passing through water that was just clear enough in the growing dawn light to reveal a silhouette. The torso narrowing to a waist, the waist extending into a tail, not a fish tail, not the horizontal flukes of a whale, a vertical tail, like a fish's, but massive. The movement was a single powerful thrust, and it was gone into the dark water below. I stood at the rail breathing hard. My hands were shaking, not from fear, from something else. The physical response to witnessing something impossible. I waited. 5 minutes, 10. I don't know exactly. Time had stopped functioning normally. I stood there expecting it to surface again, needing it to surface again, because I needed to confirm what I'd just seen. It surfaced 20 feet off the starboard side, farther away this time, watching from a distance, the head and shoulders above the water, motionless. We stayed like that, two beings regarding each other across open water while the sun started to rise behind me. That's when I saw the others, not close, 50, maybe 60 feet out, 3 more shapes at the surface, smaller, watching. I couldn't see them as clearly, they stayed farther away, and the light still wasn't strong, but I could see enough. The same vertical posture, the same silhouettes. A group. The one near my boat made the sound again. The same pattern as before. Then it gestured again toward the south, more emphatically this time, the arm rising higher, the hand making a clear directional indication. I understood in that moment that it was trying to warn me, not threaten. Warn. There's a difference in body language, even across species. I'd seen aggressive seals, aggressive sea lions. I knew what threat looked like in the water. This wasn't that. This was urgent communication from something that wanted me to understand and was running out of ways to make me understand. I looked south again. The horizon was empty, just water, no boats, no storms, no visible danger. When I looked back, they were gone, all of them. The water was empty. I stood at the rail for another 10 minutes, scanning the surface. Nothing. The sun broke the horizon. The water turned from black to gray to that early morning blue-green. The world became ordinary again, except I was still shaking. I pulled in the net without finishing the set. I didn't want to be there anymore. That feeling, the specific feeling that you're somewhere you shouldn't be, that you've seen something you weren't meant to see, was overwhelming. I needed to go home. I started the engine. I pointed the boat toward shore. My hands operated the controls without my full attention because my mind was still processing what had happened. Halfway back to the dock, I made my decision. I would tell my wife, only her. I would tell her exactly what I'd seen, and then we would decide together what to do about it. I docked at 8:30. No one else was around yet. I secured the boat, gathered my gear, and drove home with the windows down because I needed air. My wife was in the kitchen when I walked in. She took one look at me and said, "What happened?" I told her everything. I'm 94 years old. I've told you what I saw. Now I'll tell you what happened next. The thing didn't just surface beside my boat and disappear. It stayed. Perhaps 30 seconds. Perhaps a full minute. Time moved strangely in those moments, the way it does when you're watching something that shouldn't exist, but does, and your mind tries to reconcile what your eyes are taking in with every certainty you've built a life around. I need you to understand the quality of the light that morning. Not full dawn yet, but no longer night. That gray hour when water and sky blur into each other and everything feels suspended. The kind of light where you can see clearly, but nothing looks quite real. The being's head remained above the waterline. I could see the structure of the face, not human, but organized in ways that suggested intelligence. The eyes tracked my movements. When I shifted my weight in the boat, the eyes followed. When I raised my hand, not threatening, just an involuntary movement of shock, the eyes moved to my hand, then back to my face. It was watching me watch it. I don't know who moved first, whether I leaned closer to the rail or whether it came closer to the boat. But the distance closed, I found myself gripping the gunwale, my face perhaps 6 feet from this thing that every rational part of my mind said could not exist. Then it made a sound, not speech, not exactly, but not animal vocalization either, something between the two. A series of tones, low, modulated, deliberate. The sounds had structure, rhythm. They felt shaped, intentional. I opened my mouth. I don't remember if I meant to respond or if I was simply making the involuntary sounds of shock. But when I did, it stopped, waited, watching me with that unnerving steadiness. Then it repeated the sounds, the same pattern, like it was trying to establish that these were not random. These meant something. I've spent 70 years trying to explain what happened next. The closest I can come is this. It didn't speak to me in words, but I understood anyway, not through language, through something older than language. The way an animal understands threat or safety without cognition. The way you know someone is watching you even when you can't see them. Recognition without explanation. What I understood was this. The being was asking me to do something, not demanding. Asking. The difference mattered then, and it matters now. It gestured, if that's even the right word, toward the deeper water beyond my boat. The movement was graceful, specific. Then it looked back at me. The pattern repeated, the tones lower now, the gesture toward the depths, the return of that gaze. It wanted me to follow it down. I understood that with complete clarity, not words forming in my head, not a voice, but knowledge arriving fully formed the way you know your own name. It was asking me to come with it beneath the surface. I don't know how long we stayed like that, me gripping the rail, it waiting. The water between us perfectly still, every part of me wanted to reach toward it. I can't explain that impulse. It wasn't rational. It was something deeper, the pull of wonder perhaps, or the human need to touch what we don't understand, to confirm reality through physical contact. I raised my hand from the rail. The being's eyes tracked the movement. It didn't retreat. It waited. My hand was perhaps 2 feet from the water when something in my body overrode my will. Some survival mechanism deeper than curiosity. My hand stopped, hovered, then slowly returned to the gunwale. I shook my head, a small movement, but clear. The being watched me for a moment longer. Then it made one more sound, different from the others, shorter. Something in the tone felt like acknowledgement, like it understood my refusal and accepted it. Then it gestured again, not toward the depths this time, toward me, toward my boat. The motion was different, harder to interpret, but what came with it was another wave of that wordless understanding. It was asking me not to speak of this, not threatening, not warning, asking, the way you might ask someone to keep a confidence, to protect something fragile by keeping it private. I nodded. I don't know if the gesture meant anything to this being, if it understood human signals. But I nodded anyway because I needed to respond to what felt like a direct request from something with agency and intelligence. The being held my gaze for one more moment. Then it descended. Not a dive, no splash, no disturbance. It simply sank back beneath the surface as if the water welcomed it home. The grayness closed over where it had been, and I was alone again with my boat and the breaking dawn. I stood there until my legs shook, until the cold penetrated my coat and my hands ached from gripping the rail, until the sun had climbed high enough that the gray hour passed and the world looked normal again. Then I pulled up the empty nets I'd forgotten I'd set, started the motor, turned the boat toward home. The whole way back, I told myself I would speak of this to no one, but I was wrong about that. I made it 6 hours. I came home that morning and went through all the usual motions, tied up the boat, secured the gear, rinsed the salt from my hands. My wife heard the truck and met me at the door the way she always did. She took one look at my face and said, "What happened?" I'd been married to Catherine for 3 years by then, long enough that she could read changes in me I didn't know were visible, long enough that lying to her felt physically wrong. I told her I needed to sit down. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where we'd eaten breakfast perhaps 5 hours earlier when the world made sense. She poured coffee, waited. Her hands were very still on her cup, and I remember thinking that was unusual. Catherine's hands were always in motion, always working something. I started talking. I told her everything, the surfacing, the eyes, the sounds, the communication I couldn't explain but knew was real, the request to follow it down, my refusal, the final gesture I interpreted as a request for silence. I told it exactly as it happened, without embellishment or interpretation. Clinical, factual. The way you'd report damage to a boat or describe where you'd set your nets. Catherine didn't interrupt, didn't ask questions. She let me finish completely. Then she sat with it for a long time. Her coffee went cold in her hands. When she finally spoke, her voice was very calm. You can't tell anyone else. Not a question, an instruction. I started to respond, to ask why or to protest that maybe someone should know, but she cut me off. Listen to me. Her hands tightened on the cup. You tell this to anyone, and they'll think you've lost your mind. You'll lose work. You'll lose respect. They'll talk about you like you're broken or dangerous or drunk. It won't matter what you actually saw. It only matters what they'll think of you for claiming you saw it. She was right. I knew it immediately. In 1956, in our town, a man who claimed to have seen a mermaid wasn't a man who'd had an extraordinary experience. He was a man who'd snapped, who couldn't be trusted, who'd become a cautionary story. But I tried again. No. Catherine's voice hardened. You're not thinking clearly. You're still in shock from whatever happened out there. I believe that you saw something. I believe you're telling me the truth about what you experienced. But the truth doesn't matter if it ruins us. The word us landed hard. This wasn't just about me. We had plans, a mortgage. Catherine was pregnant with our first child, though we hadn't told anyone yet. One story about sea monsters could unravel everything we were building. The thing asked you not to speak of it, Catherine continued. So don't. Honor what it asked. Keep us safe. Forget this morning ever happened. But that was the problem. I couldn't forget it. The encounter had written itself into my memory with permanent ink. Every detail sharp, every moment retrievable. Forgetting wasn't possible. I don't mean actually forget, Catherine said, reading my face again. I mean, act like it never happened. Don't talk about it. Don't hint at it. Don't let it show. She reached across the table and took my hands. Hers were warm from holding the coffee cup. Mine were still cold. Promise me, she said. Promise me you'll never tell anyone. I looked at my wife, 24 years old, pregnant, trusting me to protect what we'd built together, asking me to carry this alone so it wouldn't touch her or the child or the life we were planning. I promise, I said, and I meant it. Catherine relaxed slightly, released my hands, picked up both our coffee cups and went to the sink. When she turned back around, her face had reorganized itself into normalcy. The conversation was over. We were moving forward. You should sleep, she said. You've been up since 3. I went to bed, didn't sleep, lay there replaying the morning while the house creaked around me, and Catherine moved through her usual routines downstairs. That night at dinner, she asked about my day the way she always did. I told her about the weather and the empty nets and the engine trouble I'd been meaning to fix. Normal things, safe things. She responded with her own ordinary news, the neighbor's sick dog, the price of flour at the market, a letter from her sister. We never mentioned the morning conversation, not that night, not the next day, not in the 3 years that followed before she brought it up again. The only sign it hadn't been forgotten was this. Sometimes I'd catch her watching me with a particular expression, not suspicion, not fear, something gentler. Like she was checking to make sure I was still myself, still the man she'd married, still capable of living in the normal world despite knowing something that existed outside it. I kept my promise. Months passed, then years. Our daughter was born, then our son. We bought a bigger boat. Catherine's father died and left us his house. Life accumulated in all the usual ways, and the morning in 1956 receded into private history. But it didn't fade. That's what Catherine had misunderstood. She'd thought time would wear it down, that the memory would lose its edges and become something I could dismiss as dream or delusion or the strange tricks isolation plays on the mind. Instead, it remained perfectly preserved. I could close my eyes in 1960 or 1970 or 1995 and return to that morning with complete clarity. The gray, light, the watching eyes, the wordless understanding, the request I'd honored not because I feared consequences, but because something in me recognized the request as legitimate. Catherine died 4 months ago. Pneumonia. Quick. She was 89. In the hospital near the end, when the morphine made her blunt and unfiltered, she suddenly gripped my hand and said, "You kept it. The promise." I didn't need to ask what she meant. "I did," I said. "Good." Her grip loosened. "You can let it go now. I won't be disappointed." Those were among her last coherent words to me. So I'm speaking now. Not because the promise doesn't matter anymore. It mattered for 70 years, and it still matters. But Catherine released me from it, told me I could let it go. And I'm 94 years old. If there are consequences for speaking, I'll be dead before they arrive. I'm 94 years old now. I've carried this for 70 years. That's not a metaphor. I mean the physical sensation of weight, something pressing against my sternum every morning when I woke, something that sat in my throat during dinner conversations, something that made certain words impossible to say, even when they would have been easy, natural, expected. My children asked me, more than once over the decades, why I stopped fishing alone, why I always needed someone in the boat with me after that winter. I told them I was getting older, needed the help. Then when I was 30, 35, 40, still needing someone with me, I said I liked the company. They accepted it. People accept the answers you give them when the truth seems unavailable. I almost told my son in 1982. He was 26. We were repairing dock pilings behind the house, working in silence the way we often did, and he asked me if I believed in God. Not church, he clarified. God. The actual question beneath the question. I understood what he was really asking, whether there was more to existence than what we could see and measure and explain, whether reality had room for the impossible. I opened my mouth. I had the words ready. The story I'd told only once before to my wife was there again, specific and immediate, as if the encounter had happened that morning instead of 26 years earlier. But I looked at my son's face, open, trusting, waiting for wisdom from his father. And I thought about my wife's words, "Never speak of it." I thought about what it would do to him to carry this knowledge, how it would separate him from every conversation about the ocean, about what's real, about what's possible, how he would scan every face to judge whether they could handle the truth he carried. I said I didn't know, about God, about anything beyond what I'd seen with my own eyes. He nodded. We went back to work. I think about that moment more than any other. There were others. A doctor in 1991, during a routine physical, asked if I had any history of psychiatric episodes, hallucinations, dissociative experiences, standard questions. I was 61 years old. The encounter was 35 years behind me, but felt as recent as my last meal. I said no history of anything like that. In 1998, a priest came to the house during my wife's first cancer scare. We thought she was dying. Turned out she had another 18 years, but we didn't know that then. He asked if there was anything I needed to confess, anything I'd been carrying that needed to be said before facing loss. I told him I'd been a good husband, faithful, honest in my business, kind to my children. All of those things were true. But I didn't tell him about the winter morning in 1956. I didn't tell him about the promise I'd made. My wife was still alive. Her instructions still held authority. Never speak of it. The weight became architecture. I built my life around it. I chose jobs that kept me coastal but not solitary on the water. I attended church but avoided theological conversations about the nature of creation. I watched documentaries about ocean exploration with my grandchildren, but left the room when they speculated about undiscovered species. I learned which topics to redirect, which questions to deflect, which silences to maintain. My wife and I never discussed it again after that first day, not once in 68 years of marriage. It sat between us, acknowledged only by what we didn't say. When our children asked why I'd stopped deep-water fishing, she would answer before I could. When friends invited me on fishing trips, she'd decline on my behalf. She became the guardian of the silence, more vigilant than I was. I think she was afraid I'd break, that the weight would become too much and I'd speak without thinking. She was protecting me from myself, or protecting something else. I was never certain which. My wife died on March 14, 2024, 70 years and 2 months after the morning I saw what I saw. I don't believe in coincidence the way I used to, but I don't know if the timing means anything. Maybe it does. Maybe after 7 decades, certain things have their own schedule. The funeral was small, our children, grandchildren, a few people from church. The priest gave a gentle homily about faith and reunion. I sat in the front pew and realized the only other person who knew the truth was gone. The only witness to my witness, the only one who'd heard the account while it was still fresh, before 70 years of repetition in my own mind had worn it smooth. I went home to an empty house. That's not self-pity, it's description. The house was empty, in a way it hadn't been since 1954. No one to monitor my words. No one to give me the look that meant redirect, deflect, stop talking. No one whose protection I needed to honor. I sat at the kitchen table that first night and said it out loud. The whole thing, beginning to end. Everything I saw, everything that happened, everything I was asked to do, I said it to the empty room and nothing terrible occurred. No consequence materialized. The house didn't collapse. I didn't collapse. But something did shift. The weight I described earlier, the physical sensation of carrying this, it changed position. It was still there. I don't think it's ever leaving. But it moved from pressing inward to pressing outward like something that needed to escape. I'm 94 years old. That's not old in the abstract way people talk about aging. It's old in the specific mortal sense. I have months, maybe a year or two if I'm fortunate. My health is fair, but declining in the way that doesn't reverse. I know what's coming. For 70 years I chose silence because I'd been told to, because I believed it protected something. My family, my sanity, my wife's peace, maybe something larger I didn't fully understand. But I'm the last one now, the last person who knows. When I die, this dies. And I've started to believe that's wrong, not because I need vindication, not because I want attention or validation or to be believed, but because what I was told that morning in 1956 wasn't just about me. The request that was made wasn't personal. It was a message, a warning maybe, an offer. I'm still not certain which. But it was meant for more than one person to carry. I decided in April, 5 weeks after my wife died, that I would speak. I didn't know how yet. Didn't know who would listen or what form it should take. But I decided the silence would end before I did. My daughter found me looking at the ocean from the back porch. I'd been standing there for an hour, maybe more. She asked if I was all right. I told her I had something to tell her. Something I'd never told her before. Something I'd never told anyone except her mother. She sat down. I saw the concern in her face, the look adult children get when they think a parent might be losing clarity, slipping into confusion. I understood. At 94, every strange statement gets evaluated for cognitive decline. I told her what happened in 1956, all of it. The encounter, the communication, the promise, her mother's warning. I told her I'd kept it for 70 years, and I was done keeping it. She was quiet for a long time. Then she asked me why now. Why, after 7 decades, was I choosing to break the silence? I told her because I'm the last one who knows, because the truth shouldn't die with me, because whatever consequences I feared for 70 years matter less than taking this to my grave. She asked if I was certain, really certain, about what I'd seen, whether time might have distorted the memory, whether I'd considered other explanations. I told her I'd considered every explanation for 70 years. I'd tested my memory against every rational alternative, and none of them fit what I witnessed. She believes me, or she believes I believe it, which at 94 might be the same thing. She's the one who helped me find a way to tell this story, to document it, to make sure it survives me. I'm speaking now because there's no one left to protect and nothing left to fear. Because I'm 94 years old and whatever judgment comes, from family, from strangers, from history, I won't be here long enough to endure much of it, and because I think I was wrong to keep silent. My wife told me never to speak of it, and I honored that instruction for 70 years. But she's gone now, and I think the being I encountered that morning wasn't asking for eternal silence. It was asking for something else, something I might have misunderstood until now. I think it was asking to be remembered. His account stands alone. One man, one morning, one encounter, but it exists within a larger pattern. Credible maritime witnesses have reported humanoid aquatic beings across centuries and coastlines with no contact between them. Norwegian fishermen in the 1930s, Japanese AMA divers in the 1960s, Scottish trawler crews in the 1970s. The descriptions carry consistent details, intelligence in the eyes, deliberate communication attempts, behavior that suggests observation of human activity. Most witnesses were professionals whose livelihoods depended on the ocean. Most told no one, or told only family, or recanted under pressure. We've mapped less than 20% of ocean depths. We know more about the surface of Mars than we know about our own seafloor. The deep ocean contains ecosystems we've never observed, pressure environments that make exploration nearly impossible, and geographic isolation that could sustain populations invisible to surface technology. Marine biologists have documented intelligence in dolphins, octopi, whales that challenges our assumptions about consciousness. We've recorded whale songs we can't translate, observed problem-solving in cephalopods that suggests complex cognition, witnessed interspecies communication we don't fully understand. The question isn't whether ocean intelligence exists. We know it does. The question is whether it could take a form we've categorized as mythology. His testimony suggests we've been asking the wrong questions, not whether mermaids are real, but whether we've created social mechanisms that make certain truths unspeakable. How many fishermen carried similar encounters to their graves because the cost of speaking outweighed the burden of silence? How many deathbed confessions were dismissed as dementia rather than documented as evidence? His disclosure comes during environmental crisis, ocean acidification, warming waters, ecosystem collapse. If an intelligent species inhabits these depths, they would be the first to recognize the danger. The timing may not be coincidental. He sits in his living room with afternoon light through the window. His hands are steady now. The weight he carried for 70 years is visible only in its absence. Whether you believe him changes nothing about what he witnessed. He knows what surfaced beside his boat. He knows what he was asked. He knows the cost of protection and the cost of silence. Somewhere in those dark waters, in depths we haven't explored, possibilities exist that our categories can't contain. His testimony is now part of the record. Other voices may follow. The ocean keeps its secrets until someone with nothing left to lose decides the truth matters more than safety.